Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of True North. I am one half of your host. I am Mark Levesque. I am executive editor here at Providence, and I am Stockdale Fellow at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the United States Naval Academy. And I am joined by
Daniel Strand, professor of ethics at the Air War College in glorious, sweet Montgomery, Alabama.
Alabama. And today we are continuing our short run series on the just war tradition, or
Mm-hmm.
just war tradition, throwing out the definite article because there's more than one tradition. The one we're
Indeed.
talking about is grounded in its classical roots, comes to us from some of the old Greeks and some of the early Christians. And we have been talking about use ad bellum, which is a really fancy way of asking when is it right to fight. And we have gone through sovereign authority. And last week we did just cause. And today we intend to talk about right intent. Do you want to start us
Sweet.
off, Mr. Strand? Dr. Strand?
Yeah, so of the three kind of fundamental criterion, or whatever we want to refer to them as, moral principles with just war, right intent, I think is it's very important, and I think it's a probably the focus on intention is where you could say the focus of Christian ethics or Christianity as a whole on sort of inward intention of one's actions becomes very important, and um, any moral act, of course, is not going, despite what people say today, that only outcomes, or we don't care about what you intend to, the intentions of one's words or so forth. Intention is absolutely essential, and in the Judeo Christian tradition, we know that there is a difference between murder and killing. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the most important things has to do with intention, right? We just saw the Derek Chauvin case for the now murder of George Floyd. That's different than saying the killing of George Floyd. Murder implies a level of intention, and you have second degree, first degree, third degree, right? All of those are fundamental. As a native of Minneapolis, I'm always attuned to what's going on there. And there was also another killing this week in Minneapolis last week, where a police officer, female police officer in Brooklyn Center, which is just north of Minneapolis, accidentally killed somebody. She thought she was grabbing her taser, and she grabbed a gun, shot this man. And apparently they're going to bring charges of manslaughter, right? Because there's a fundamental difference due to intention. So intention is extremely important. It doesn't get probably as much, and once again, it's hard to do when you're looking at nations, looking at what they intend to do in this or that war. We tend to be a pretty cynical people these days, and so we always people tend to read into someone's intentions. But nevertheless, the war tradition says intention really matters. What we intend to do in war can't be for aggrandizement, it can't be for conquest. It has to be ultimately for restoring a state of peace to the best of our ability. What I think Augustine coined the term, the tranquility of order.
That's right. So let me interject here. So right intent in a just war is peace, the restoration of order. Is that monolithic? So every just war, that is the intention, is the restoration of order, of peace. So this is variable. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. I think the intention always has to be towards some sort of restoration of the best possible conditions, but the world as it is. And I think many Westerners, Americans, they have a very idealistic view of the way that society functions, and they get maximally frustrated when things don't kind of pan out to the world that they have in their minds. But most people outside the West, I would say, understand that the world is actually very fragile, and maybe this pandemic has removed some of that that confidence and idealism in the sense of showing just how fragile the pandemic can throw the world into such kind of upheaval. But to your point, um, no, I mean, so what is? Throw the question back to you in some ways. What would peace look like in the Middle East? What would it look like in Europe versus North America? What would it look like on the borders of Russia and Eastern Europe? What would it look like between China? What would it look like in Afghanistan? Right, we're pulling out of Afghanistan. I think an interesting question, or at least a good debatable question. That it's an empirical one, but in the end, it's what does peace look like in Afghanistan? This country that seems to be untamable. Some people want to stay long term and think maybe it's more of argument I've made is that's kind of more of a Colombia scenario where we stuck it out in Colombia. We provided military aid for them and assistance, and look what happened. Colombia turned out, I mean, they brokered a deal. They've ended this long sort of civil war going on, and so they're actually coming about something that actually looks like peace, like a somewhat functioning democracy. Um, could that happen in Afghanistan?
Right.
Um, so,
Peace
yeah.
and the ambitions you have toward moving toward peace are going to be context dependent, right?
Hmm.
It's one thing to hope that we can, in a domestic scene, reconcile with our neighbors in Minneapolis. That might look like one thing,
Yeah.
but that might be it's a far cry to expect the same things out of a part of the world where sort of none of the conditions on the ground um, look toward being conducive uh, to peace, right? Maybe a better approximation of peace. And this brings us to the question of, what is peace composed of? And you start to break it down and you recognize, as you've talked about, Augustine's Tranquility of Order,
Mm.
order being a precursor for peace, justice being a part of all of that. So justice and order, maybe together, begin to make peace.
Hmm.
And yeah, you look throughout the globe, you look in our own cities, and you don't necessarily see a whole lot of justice, or even if you do, you don't see a whole lot of order necessarily, right?
Hmm.
Or varying degrees of it.
Yeah.
So the best you can do is an approximation. And so
Hmm.
when we say the right intent is peace, so then you might say, okay, so why an airstrike in Syria? Because Assad, barrel bombed or gassed his own people. You think that the airstrike is going to lead to peace? Well, no, we don't. Good question. Very limited objective here, right? We
Yeah.
want you to stop barrel bombing and gassing your people, and that's going to be the restoration of order that we're asking for. It's not much. It's a low bar. It doesn't promote justice and order in your society in other ways, so it's limited. Um, so you and I have talked a lot about if right intent is peace, then built into that is the assumption that you're going to fight to win. Uh, but not every win looks the same, right? It might not mean the destruction of the regime against which we're combating. It might simply mean my objective today is for you to stop, you know, committing atrocities, to
Hmm.
stand down, and we stand down, and we've reached a ton, and it's not perfect, but it's better than we had. Um, History has taught us that justice and order are goods, um, because they lead to peace. Uh, but maybe order without a full measure of justice is still better than anarchy.
Yeah.
You have to make these sorts of deals, maybe with the devil,
Hmm.
just because the world is a real place that real people have to live in,
Yeah.
and our ambitions aren't always.
Yeah. I mean, so what do you make of this? When I think about kind of just your average everyday American looking out the world, one of the criticisms you're going to see, and this is where I feel like people from a more realist perspective, which is going to say something like the world's just a bad place. Um, the United States needs to look after its own interests first, and that means doing bad stuff, making alliances with bad people, and that's just the way it works, right? So that's maybe a sort of generic perspective. And then you have, I think, this is where the sort of pacifist comes full circle with the realist, and they're actually quite close on many issues in their reading of things. Is yeah, that's it. That's why Christians don't get involved in the bloody goriness of international politics. It's brutal. It's rough. It's full of lesser evils and all these sorts of things that we need to sort of purify our hands from. So they agree with the realists in terms of the sort of analysis, right? So that criticism of the just warrior, or this idea that we're talking about, seeking peace, is that this is a sort of moral. This is sort of a moralization.
Right.
It's making something ethical that's not. It's fooling ourselves, I guess. And so you'll get criticisms about why are we allies with Saudi Arabia?
Right.
Why are we allies with Saudi Arabia? Because we want to balance the power of Iran,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And so Saudi Arabia, in the sort of that bulwark, is the one thing that we have to sort of keep the Iranians at bay from the designs on the Middle East. Now, how do you respond to the person who makes these criticisms? Because I'll defend to a certain extent the Saudis' war against Yemen, even though it's brutal. I mean, there's starvation, it's gory, it's terrible. In part on those grounds, right? That it's a proxy war for the Iranians, and the Iranians are fomenting all sorts of discord around the Middle East. And so, if the intent is peace in the end, some sort of peace, then that seems what we have to do. But how do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, it should be wherever you sit on that, it should be uncomfortable, right? You shouldn't be glad about being friends with the Saudis when the Saudis, are guilty of all sorts of violations against dignity, right?
Hmm.
But you could probably make the case that, this whole idea of right intent, peace, and all of that, a lot of this hinges, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, a lot of this hinges on justice, right? And justice is giving each their due. That's been true from Aristotle to Cicero to Aquinas. And the idea of giving people their due, or giving states their due, regimes their due, all of that, international justice, whatever we're talking about, built into that is the necessity of discrimination, of making discriminatory judgments between righteousness and wickedness, good and evil, innocence and guilt, those sorts of basic judgments. And these judgments are probably best made with scalpels and not, hatchets, right? And so you look at Saudi Arabia and you think, okay, look, we have a role to play in the Middle East. Maybe for, in one sense, altruistic reasons to help, the Middle East, but for selfish reasons too, right? Peace in the Middle East, the free flow of oil, all sorts of goods that resonate and reverberate throughout the globe and rebound to our own interests, right? We have vested interests here. So who are we going to be friends with? Okay, we have Israel, that's grand. Who else are we going to be friends with? Saudi Arabia, is a powerhouse in the region, and they're better than others in the region. They're not great, but they're pretty good. Now we could be great friends with Bahrain, and that gets us a certain, set of benefits, but it would also be really good to be aligned with, another military power. Saudi Arabia is there. They're not great. It seems to me that America has two types of basic power, right? We have the power of intimidation. You mess with us and free men and women will kill you. That's the military, right? That's hard power and
Mhm.
some of the more coercive aspects of soft power in some ways.
Mhm.
That's one power, intimidation. The other power is persuasion, right? Inspiration. And with Saudi Arabia, we could intimidate them, or we could try to come alongside them and inspire them and try to make incremental changes where we can.
Mhm.
I don't know this, but it would be interesting to see where was Saudi Arabia at one point, where is Saudi Arabia now, and
Yeah.
have people in Saudi Arabia benefited from our alliance with their government. My guess is yes. Maybe that's not true. And if it's not true, then it's to our shame, because if you've been friends with somebody for a long time, that
Hmm.
person could be better. I mean, look
Yeah.
at you, right? Since we've been friends, you are just a better human being,
Yeah, it's true.
right? I mean, we could drag Tanya in here and she would say, well, right? So I'm America, you're Saudi Arabia. I should have an influence, right? Be something like that.
Yeah.
I think another response that I have is just, at the bottom, I touched on this being, hinging on a question of justice. And so I think when so many people look at the world, and in particular looking at a world in which there's war, good men and women see war on the one side and they see peace on the other. And they hear Daniel Strand talking about peace being the right intent of war. And they think you're a lunatic because these two spheres, war and peace, are discontinuous.
There you go.
There's no overlap. They're absolutely incommensurable. One cannot influence the other. In fact, they're binaries,
Yeah.
opposites. And
Right.
that's according to Christian intelligence, classic thought, that's a false dichotomy, right? War and peace um, are not necessarily opposites.
Hmm.
And I think the just war tradition, by putting intention up there, says and making it the right intent peace,
Hmm.
acknowledges that peacemaking uh, is difficult work. Yes, as followers of Christ, we should, always up to us live in peace with all men.
Hmm.
But there are limits to that, right? Our enemies have a vote. That's one limit.
Hmm.
Um, who we are as Christians is another limit, because as Christians, we're supposed to do justice. And we
Hmm.
already noted that doing justice is giving to each their due, it's making discriminating judgments. And if somebody is doing an act of evil, then justice is one to identify them as doing an act of evil.
Hmm.
And the work of justice is also to get them to stop. So last week we talked about right intention, or we talked about just cause. And we said, protect the innocent, right? That's due to them. The innocent deserve protection. Dignity demands that people take on the burden and the duty of protecting the innocent. We talked about another just cause being, taking back things that have been wrongly taken. When, people wrongly take your stuff, if it's land or if it's your women or your daughters or whatever it happens to be, justice demands making that judgment, identifying that as wrong, and restoring wrongly taken things to the people who they're due to. Right? That's,
Hmm.
that's a justice issue. And
Yeah.
then this idea about punishing the guilty or punishing evil, that's making the discriminating judgment that what you've done is wrong and it needs to be stopped. Uh, that's justice work,
Hmm.
right? And these things are necessary precursors to peace. I think last week we said that peace is not a virtue; peace is the fruit of virtue. Justice is one of the cardinal virtues, right? You can do it in excess, you could do it in deficiency. You must do
Hmm.
that the right amount of justice, the right things in the right way to the right people. Uh, has in this world the best and maybe only chance of approximating something like peace. Um, you see that as the golden thread, I guess, in the just war tradition, right? So if the right intention is peace, and peace is a product of justice, then from that you start getting principles of proportionality, right? Which says that the right things are owed to particular people. You give each their due, the combatants, the non-combatants, the innocent,
Hmm.
the guilty.
Hmm.
Discrimination, the same sort of
Yep.
thing. All these things begin to radiate out from a proper understanding of what justice is.
Yeah.
That's
So,
in
Mark, you made this distinction between sort of the sphere of peace and the sphere of war, and oftentimes we think of them as sort of two hermetically sealed bubbles, right? We go from this state of peace to the state of war, and we can kind of decide what are you getting at with that? Why flesh that out just a little bit more because you touched on it, but I'm just interested in hearing why you think that's a false dichotomy.
uh, well, because I mean,
Why is that important? Yeah.
in part, we both touched on this already today, but in this world, um, peace doesn't just fall from heaven, and justice doesn't just fall from heaven, sort of already baked and
Hmm.
ready to go.
Right.
Romans 13, right? God God provides a government
Mhm.
and expects that this government colludes with the divine in
Mhm.
order to bring about the conditions necessary for justice, order, and peace.
Mhm.
But it takes human work. I mean, the mandate from the very beginning has been to exercise dominion, and uh, in a fractured world that's cursed because of human fallenness, uh, a part of dominion means the restoration of order. You know,
Mhm.
and uh, I don't see any other way that that necessarily comes about. Now, um, if somebody does something wrong and somebody confronts them with a strong word and identifies what they've done as wrong, some people will stand down and they
Right.
will repent and they'll stop. And then you stop also because the job is done.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, war wasn't necessary. Any coercion more than a word, and let's not be under the illusion that this isn't just a trajectory, right? There's the harsh word of rebuke, and then
Mhm.
maybe on the other end there's war, but that's a continuum. And where I plot myself on that continuum is very largely dependent on the person who's doing the injustice, right? If a harsh word stops him, then we're reconciled. If it takes
Right.
something more than that, then if it's sufficiently great evil, then you amp it up. So
So you're aiming that you're thinking that there's a group of people or an assumption, um, let's just say Americans, who think peace is sort of the natural baseline. It's just how humans normally live,
mhm,
and so war is a sort of violation of that. Versus something like peace is an achievement. It's something that we need to constantly protect, preserve with all these different tools, government, civil society, families, institute, whatever. And that war, and that the military power is one of those tools, but a necessary tool to sort of cultivate that. So you have these kind of two different paradigms.
right.
It seems like you're tracking with.
Yeah, I think that's
Right.
right. And I think they're not entirely distinct, right? I think they overlap in important ways. Augustine, and he wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last, but he made the important observation that at one level, all human beings have a natural uh, propensity to drive toward peace. So
Right.
even competing, clans of the mafia
Yeah.
are most likely going to desire some sort of peace
Right.
between.
Right.
Uh, at the same time, they're the mafia, right? They've also got a vested interest in not being particularly peaceful with other groups.
Hmm.
So there's these, we're human beings, so there's these dual drives
Yeah.
for both peace and conflict,
Right.
because uh, and so it's both.
So
Both have to be
just
taken.
war is going. Just war is going to say not all. So here's what I kind of draw from what you're saying is everybody wants peace of some sort or another, right? But what the just war is going to say, um,
Mm,
we have to judge those pieces,
that's
right?
right.
So
That's
the
right.
piece of the dictatorship
Yep.
might it might be worth preserving given
Right.
the alternatives. It
Right.
might not be the piece, a piece worth preserving.
Yep.
Uh, and
I think.
so where I think a lot of Westerners get their hands up when they see the United States, poking around another part of the world, they say, "Leave it alone, just leave it alone." And I think the rejoinder is going to be, it may be peaceful, but that doesn't a piece worth preserving. Some pieces are not worth preserving. Some
That's right.
pieces are worth taking up arms, and especially if you live in those countries, you might think, yeah, going to war and fighting a team is justified.
That's right. And this is where we'll come. I think next time we'll talk about some of the prudential categories of the jus ad bellum, right? We've already moved through the deontological ones, the ones that have to be there.
Right.
Next week, we should talk about some of the prudential sort of side constraints that even if we have a legitimate authority, a just cause, and a right intention, prudence might dictate standing down and not pulling the trigger, right? And
Right.
that one of those prudential judgments is the probability of success. And while Christian hopefulness is, a virtuous thing, we shouldn't be naive. And there are certain aspirations that we have about going in and fixing the peace that are likely only going to make matters worse.
Right.
You say, okay, this isn't perfect, and this for some people in that regime, it's a hell on earth. But to go in there and break it, we're going to make it worse. And we've seen that in recent history, right? So there we are.
There we are.
Right intention. Pretty good.
We must intend.
Must intend rightly.
Yeah.
All right, my friend, we should probably end because we are approaching 25 minutes and my managing editor is going to find me liable for just cause. So we should stop. But this was good. I think this was good.
Yeah.
We'd like to hear from people. I feel like I'm talking to a black hole. If this is helpful, send us emails.
Sure.
Praise and compliments to mlevecki at gmail.com. Complaints and criticisms to Daniel Strand. Perfect.
Happily receive my critics.
All right. Thank you, Dan. We will talk to you next time.
All right. Till next time. See you, Mark.
You all.